Well, welcome. Thank you for joining me. This is our last lesson on the book of Genesis, and that is Israel in Egypt. That is where the book ends. It begins, of course, with the creation of the world, but ends with the children of Israel, literally, the Jacob, Israel, and his 12 sons have gone to Egypt, and it's going to end there with the death of Jacob and the death of Joseph. The author is so careful in tying up so many loose ends and resolving so many plot lines. We need to get right at it if we're not going to take too long tonight. So, Israel and Egypt, the end of the book of Genesis, now. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there, and they grew, and they multiplied exceedingly. Now, we talked about Abraham chosen as the beginning of the patriarchs. Now we've come to the other end. And the question is because Abraham is the vehicle of the promise. God made a threefold promise to Abraham. And that threefold promise is, first of all, to make of Abram a great nation. Secondly, to give Abram the land of promise, which was the land of Canaan, which is not where they are right now. They're in Egypt. And finally, that through Abram, all the nations of the world would be blessed. That's the threefold promise. And Abraham has come and gone. Isaac has come and gone. Jacob now is he's taking his 12 sons and his whole party and going to Egypt. So the question is, the promise that was given to Abram, which begins this process of restoring Eden, restoring mankind to reconciliation with God, and all of that. Abram was the answer. The promise to him was what mattered. Where are we when we get to the end of the book of Genesis with regard to this promise? What's happening? Because a long time has passed now. These men lived a long time, and here we are at the end of the life, approaching the end of the life of Jacob, and before we're done tonight, the end of the life of Joseph as well. Where is the promise? Okay. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there, and they grew and they multiplied exceedingly. So the promise, it doesn't look too bad. He has 12 sons, and they multiplied exceedingly. Now I've got this little green. Of course, green is the positive direction, but it's only 12 sons, and it's not a great nation yet. But at least it's moving in the right direction. Remember, for the first several generations, there were only two. There was Ishmael and Isaac, but Ishmael didn't count. There was Jacob and Esau, but Esau isn't part of the promise. And now Jacob has 12 sons, and they are beginning to multiply. So there's a beginning of at least some perception that this part of the promise is being fulfilled, but it's just starting. All right. And that's a key understanding, that here we are. The promise, as Genesis closes, is to make Abram, the promise was to make Abram a great nation. And there were 12 sons, and they multiplied exceedingly. So there's progress on that front. Now, we have a lot of keys tonight. And I'm going to take the 3 keys of the promise and put them into one, because otherwise we just end up with so many key understandings. But this is the way Genesis is. Any book, any good book, when you finish, come to the end of that book, there are a lot of details that are resolved, a lot of situations that are resolved, a lot of loose ends that are tied up. And as we come to the end of Genesis, in this last several chapters, a lot of these threads are being tied off. A lot of them are being settled and resolved. A lot of them are we're announced where their status is, because this is important. At the end of Genesis, we need to know where the process has come to. And by the way, I want to say it now. If you are enjoying this, if you find these insights useful to you, please press the like button. And if you want to be sure and get all of these videos, press subscribe, and you'll be notified whenever they come out. And of course, both of those help us, because it helps other people, YouTube and others, say, hey, this must be interesting because people are watching it. So sharing and pressing subscribe and pressing like really helps us. And of course, we always covet your prayers. And at the end, you'll see some of their addresses where you can help support this ministry financially if you choose to do so, if God convicts you of that. Anyway, here we are with the promises Genesis closes to make of Abram a great nation. Well, at least there's a hint that it could be happening because there are 12 sons now, and they are exceedingly multiplying exceedingly. And in fact, when we study Exodus, I don't know when that'll be yet, but when we study Exodus, we'll see that they continue to multiply exceedingly. This is what Pharaoh says to Jacob: settle your father and brother and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. So the Goshen is the best of the land. Pharaoh is rationally grateful. It makes sense for him to be grateful to Joseph because he saved the kingdom of Egypt, the empire. He saved all of this. Many, many people's lives have been saved through his ministry. And so when his father and brothers come, Pharaoh says, give them the best. You've given us the best. You've saved us. So we want to express our gratitude by giving you the best. And if you know any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Well, this is very ironic because, of course, that was one of the reasons Laban wanted to keep Jacob, because Jacob was very skillful with livestock. And now, the next generation, the same thing's being asked. All right, so Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen. They had possessions there. This is the memory text again. But they dwelt in the land of Egypt. And of course, this is another part of the promise as Genesis closes. The promise was to make Abram a great nation. 12 sons, they multiplied exceedingly. To give Abram the land of promise. Well, the problem is now they're dwelling in Egypt. They're not in the land of promise at all. So that's why that's in red. That's a really bad sign. Doesn't look like that part of the promise is going to be fulfilled. And that's where they are. They settle down, okay? So as the promise as Genesis closes the promise was to give Abraham the land of promise, but they dwelt in Egypt. And that's a key to understanding. Again, we need to know what this threefold promise is, because that's the whole purpose of telling the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the main purpose, probably not the whole purpose, but it's the main purpose is to tell how God has promised to save his people, to bring salvation to this earth through the line of Abram. And so we're following that line so we can see how God interacts with those he chooses, and also how he wants to use them to save all nations. And that this is this is the threefold promise. And if we don't know where that is, then we don't understand the purpose and importance of the book of Genesis, because it's crucially important. Jacob goes to Joseph. With the two sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt, the members of Jacob's family, which went to Egypt, were 70 in all. Now, again and again, we talk about this. When there is a detail in Scripture, a very specific detail, then we need to pay attention, because the author won't waste our time with telling us details that have no importance. They may be difficult to understand, they may not be clear to us, and that can happen. Our knowledge is limited. But we need to look and see if these details in fact matter. And so he didn't go into Egypt with a great multitude or a large household. He went with 70. In all, there were 70. So apparently the number 70 matters to the author. Well, of course, in Genesis 10, we had the number 70 before. And as the author of these lessons says, to his credit, does a very good job on this, the number 70 corresponds to the number of nations. It's called the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, suggesting, foreshadowing. It's like a lot of these things. It isn't exactly a prophecy. It is an indicator. It is a marker. It is a signpost that points in a general direction, suggesting that the destiny of all the nations is also at stake in Jacob's journey. And of course, in the immediate sense, it is because all of the nations are going to be saved. All the nations that are mentioned, they talk about the whole world practically, that is saved from famine because God brought Joseph to Egypt where they stored up the grain from the 7 fat years. And so in that one sense, in the immediate sense, Jacob represents everybody else who's also being saved from famine by God's ministry through Joseph. An amazing thing. But it also points to the fact that part of the promise, remember, was that all the nations would be blessed through Abram. Now, again, in a very narrow and immediate sense in Jacob's day, this is being fulfilled by Joseph in Egypt. But of course, the promise to Abraham has a much longer scope and a much broader application. And we need to, and the author of Genesis not only knows this, he wants his audience to remember it. He wants his audience to know it. And so he writes this. And there was the promise. The promise as Genesis closes. Through Abram, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And Israel's party, 70, I have this in yellow, a cautionary sign, a little green at the bottom. It's just an indicator. It's just a shadow. It's just the tiniest suggestion. But it is a suggestion. And it does make a difference. And so here's where the status is. This is a key understanding. Through Abraham, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Jacob's party equals 70. Don't go to sleep on this, as they say. Because the promise, as Genesis closes, to make Abram a great nation, we saw there were 12 sons. Now, for the first time, there's multiple. And it's 12 is a large number. My father was one of 11 children. I can tell you have a lot of cousins in that situation. My mother was one of 9, so I have lots and lots and lots of cousins. But he married 12 brothers, and they had large families. So this is a big party. To give Abraham the land of the promise. This is the red one, the one that doesn't look too good. They dwelt in Egypt. They're not dwelling in the land of promise right now. So that's a real cautionary tale. That's a concern. The promise doesn't look very good in that aspect of it. That through Abraham all the nations of the world would be blessed. Well, that's this cautionary shadow. It's a good idea. It's an indicator. It's not a clear prophecy. It's not even a type or an anti-type type of situation. It is simply an indicator that the alert reader will catch, because there were 70 nations in the entire world according to Genesis 10. This is the table of nations. So there we are. And the problem, as Genesis closes, and this is a key understanding, is that, and here we are. I said I take the first 3, the promise to Abram, the 3 things. They're all key concepts, but I'm going to combine them in one. So we had one. We're going to end up with a manageable number of key concepts from this lesson. After 4 generations, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, because as Genesis closes, it closes with the death of Joseph and his speech as he's dying. So there are 4 generations. After 4 generations, the promise is far from fulfilled. There are 12 sons, and they multiply exceedingly. But still, if each of them has 12, that's 144. It's not a huge number. It's not a great nation, certainly not compared to Egypt at the time, which was a great nation in terms of population, power, reach, and so forth. And so that's a key understanding here, that after 4 generations, the promise is far from being fulfilled. There are hints in 2 of these parts of the promise, 2 of the provisions. There are hints that it's going to work. In the 3rd one, it doesn't look very good at all right now, because they're in Egypt and not in Canaan. And I said there are a lot of key points here, so we put 4 of them. We put 3 of them into one. 4 generations. So we follow it. And by the way, this is the end of the tale of the patriarchs, because after this, Israel goes into slavery for centuries, and then it goes to the time of the judges. We don't have the time of the one patriarch and his family. They become a very large nation. Historians believe 2 million left in the Exodus, although that's in the book of Exodus, and we're not there yet. That's a lot of people, and that may have just been the men. So a large number, whatever it was large enough to be, especially in those days, a great nation. So, but then it isn't one man or one family. It is this whole nation. And you have the judges, and we can go on as we see how the promise is slowly fulfilled. But after 4 generations, it doesn't look really very good. All right. Now, Jacob blesses Joseph's sons. There's so many points here. Again, I'm rushing because I don't want to go beyond 30 minutes if I can avoid it. Last week was too long. I try to keep them short for you. Now, the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. Isn't it interesting? Here we have, and it's just hard to underestimate the irony. Great literature, and we're told, has irony. And here is irony. Jacob's life has been full of irony. He was the firstborn who stole, he was the secondborn who stole the firstborn's rights. He goes to marry the secondborn, and he's told that the firstborn daughter, Leah, has rights. It goes on and on. And here, when Jacob went in to steal his brother's birthright, to steal the birthright, his father Isaac was so old he couldn't see; he was blind. And now we have this complete cycle turnaround. Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. So we have a repetition of this scene, except that Joseph is coming in being perfectly honest. And in fact, whereas Jacob confused his father, he claimed to be Esau when he was not, and wore the goat skin and all that. Here, Jacob puts his hands, as though he were confused, on the wrong heads. He puts his right hand for the birthright on Ephraim, who's the second born, instead of on Manasseh. And so Joseph alerts him to this situation, which is interesting. So again, Jacob intentionally deceived his father. Joseph intentionally makes it clear that his father is not deceived. And Jacob says, no, this is the way it will be. And then he repeats almost verbatim what the angel told his mother, which is that the younger one will be the ruler over the older one, just as he was the ruler over. So there's a lot of irony, a lot of repetition in this scene where Joseph brings his sons to be blessed. But what they get is even more than, in some ways, the birthright. You wonder what happened to Joseph. Why is Joseph not the leader? Because later on, as we mentioned before, the tribes that are royal tribes are Benjamin, the second son of Rachel, and Judah, the fourth son of Leah. So those are the two royal tribes, the two tribes that make up the nation of Judah when the two kingdoms separate. And Joseph and neither Joseph nor his sons are represented there. But Joseph right now is going to receive something which is in many ways a greater recognition than the birthright. We'll see that in a moment here. Because the birthright in the human custom in those days was a very simple principle. And that is, when a man died, his belongings, his holdings, his wealth was divided by the number of sons he had plus one. So in Jacob's case, there would be 13 parts it would be divided into. Although when we get to the end, you'll see that actually there's going to be more than 12 sons according to adoption and the custom of the times. But right now, let's say 12 sons, so you divide it into 13 parcels. The oldest son, the firstborn, got 2 of those, the double portion. Now, this double portion shows up repeatedly in Scripture when Elijah says to Elisha, if you see me go up, what is it that you want? And Elisha says, a double portion of the Spirit. He's talking about the oldest brother, the birthright. That's what he's seeking. And the ancient Israelites would have understood that to be the case. So the double portion was the right of the one who had the birthright, the one who would carry on the family name, the one who would be the first among equals, we might say. And so after he blesses the sons, he says this, I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. Whatever this was, there was land or some other possessions. He's going to divide it up into 13 parcels, and he's going to give Joseph 2 of them. This is a clear designation of Joseph as the one to carry on, Joseph the ruler. Of course, Joseph is literally the ruler in Egypt, and we see this several times in the last 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis, even after the death of his father, where they all bowed down to him and said, we are your slaves. Well, of course, he doesn't accept that. He doesn't, impose that upon them. And he also says this, Ephraim and Manasseh. So these are Joseph's sons. Manasseh was firstborn, Ephraim second, but Jacob switches his hands so that Ephraim gets the firstborn. So he's listed first here. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine as Reuben and Simeon are. Now Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob's sons, and Simeon was the secondborn. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Okay? Reuben and Simeon. Those are the first and second sons of Jacob. And he's saying Ephraim, who's the secondborn, will be now taking the place of the firstborn. And Manasseh shall be mine as Reuben and Simeon are. So he's saying that they will not be counted as your children, but as my sons. So he's elevating the Ephraim and Manasseh from being grandsons to being sons. And how does this, what does it matter? Well, in the end, we have what we talk about in the 12 tribes of Israel. We have there are 13 names, because Levi gets no land, so there's still 12 divisions of land. But Ephraim and Manasseh are both reckoned to be half tribes. Ephraim and Manasseh are half tribes, but they are tribes because they are reckoned to be sons of Jacob, not grandsons. Because none of the other grandsons have a tribe named after them. None of the others. Only Ephraim and Manasseh. So he has just elevated Joseph's sons to his own sons. He elevated them to, again, they will eventually be tribes. They will be important names in the country, in the nation of Israel. So what happens here is Joseph has received a double portion. This is, it's 2 squared. 2 times 2 is 4. It's the square. And because he receives a double of what Jacob had taken from the Amorite with his own bow, he said. And he receives, instead of him being a tribe, although he's listed Revelation, that's another whole story. But instead of Joseph, there being a tribe of Joseph, there's a tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh. So there essentially are 2 tribes. He gets to be 2 of the brothers, 2 tribes. So he gets a double portion both ways. He gets a double portion of the belongings directly, and each of them gets a portion when he dies, of course, and each of them becomes a tribe. So Joseph gets a double portion. There's no more effective way of designating him as the ruler of his brothers. And this is not a matter of politics. It's not a matter of what's going on in Egypt. It's a matter of what's going on in Jacob's family. And so Jacob is essentially appointing Joseph as the leader of all of his sons. Okay? And that's a kind of a big deal. And that's a key understanding here, that Joseph receives a double portion. Now, unless you think these ideas of squaring, for example, or cubing numbers, is just, sort of my idea that I'm imposing in Scripture, do not forget that in Revelation, the number of when it says there 12,000 reached the 12 tribes, that's 12 squared, 144,000. Okay? And in New Jerusalem, the dimensions are cube. So this idea of squaring and cubing numbers is not something that is alien. And so Joseph gets a double. He gets a fourfold instead of 1. And by the way, that's how much, interestingly enough, when the law of Moses comes along, when the judgments, as they're called, the implementation of the Ten Commandments as the civil law of Israel comes along. If a man steals a sheep, for example, he is to replace it fourfold. So you could say that, as because Joseph was sold into slavery, he lost out, but Jacob here restores it fourfold. So there's this idea that's lurking in the back of the Old Testament all the way through of this double, the double portion for the elder brother and the double here for Joseph. So Joseph is definitely the leader. All right. We're getting close to the end. As I said, there's an awful lot of material here, and I understand if there are questions, I think people can contact me, but I want to get done with this. So Jacob dies. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. Well, this is an interesting notion. Here is this, the son of the viceroy, the father of the viceroy of Egypt, that is Joseph's father, Jacob, dies. And because Joseph is so important, then all Pharaoh's officials go with Joseph to bury his father in a foreign land. Now, I say it's a foreign land, but Egypt's influence goes that far. Egypt is a very great power, militarily, politically, and economically, certainly at this time, because they're the ones that have food. And chariots and horsemen also went up with him. I don't know. Again, this is one of those odd details, and I'm going to point out a couple of things. Now, one is I want to shamelessly plug my book, just because I wrote a book on the life of Jacob, and when you do something like that, I said something as well as I knew how to say it, and I'm going to share that here in my book, Torn: Jacob's Story. I wrote this about this idea of the officials following. The babe who had come into the world clutching his brother's heel now went to his burial with all the pomp and power of the great Egyptian empire at his heels. Interesting here. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials went and accompanied him. Chariots and horsemen went also up with him. I mentioned this already, but I'm going I wanted to point out that there is a parallel between the chariots and the horsemen. Because when Israel in the Exodus leaves Egypt, here it says the water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed Israelites. So there's an irony here in that when Joseph buries his father, Jacob, all of the officialdom goes and follows, including chariots and horsemen. That's mentioned specifically as they go to bury Jacob in the promised land, in the cave of Machpelah. All right. And then, again, one of these ironies, whether it's a type and antitype, whether it's just an indicator, but it's fascinating that the author of Exodus points out that water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the chariots and the horsemen. When Israel in the Exodus seeks to return to the land where Jacob is buried, they're also followed by Pharaoh and officials and chariots and horsemen. But this time, the chariots and the horsemen are buried in water. And they die there. It's interesting because, again, Jacob is buried in the land of his fathers, the land of the promise. And Pharaoh and his army, when they follow after the Exodus, are buried in water. And water is we've talked about this many times, the symbol of chaos, of disorder in the ancient world. And so it's interesting, whereas Jacob is buried in the land that has been promised to his grandfather Abram, Pharaoh is buried in the symbol of disorder, which is the power he represents. Then Joseph said to his brothers, so we go quickly from the death of Jacob to the death of Joseph in the book of Genesis. It moves very rapid. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die. but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph is dying. He's dying. And we talked about this. The promise doesn't look good because they're physically dwelling in Egypt. He's dying in Egypt, but he says, God will come to your aid, and he will deliver you. And when he does, take my bones and bury them in the land of promise. And so here we have these two things that took place at the same time. One is Joseph's death, and he gives this prophecy at his death. And the other is the manner of the burial of Jacob. And that is Jacob's burial procession foreshadows, and Joseph's prophecy predicts deliverance. They're both pointing toward this. And of course, in many ways, even in the Exodus, Pharaoh escorted them out. They paid them to leave, and then they still pursued them, but they paid them to leave. So this same kind of thing where God uses Pharaoh. And when I say uses, it's because Pharaoh will not be his son. C.S. Lewis says it makes a difference whether we serve God's purposes as sons or as tools, as his children or as his tools, because God's will come forth. And if we will, we can be a joyous part of that, and we can enjoy it. But if we try to frustrate his purposes, we can certainly do so in our own case. He's not willing that any should perish, and if we just determine to perish, we will. But he cannot, his overarching will to save those who trust in him will not be frustrated. And our efforts to frustrate that will only cause our own doom, which is exactly what happens to Pharaoh and his army. So this is a key understanding. Jacob's burial procession foreshadows, and Joseph's prophecy predicts deliverance. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. I said I took, I think we had 7 total keys here. So 6 or 7 different keys, and I wanted to combine them into 3. So the first key is to remember that after 4 generations, the promise is far from fulfilled. So in that sense, Genesis ends on a downer. They're in the land of Egypt, and Joseph is dying there. Jacob has died there. That's where they are. They're not near to the land of promise. And that's the biggest cautionary tale. There are many more than there used to be. That's a good sign. And the fact that God has already blessed the nations through Joseph's ministry, that's a good sign. But the middle one that we had, that the land of promise, doesn't look very good at all. So in one way, Israel, the book of Genesis ends on a downer. It's important to understand that Joseph receives a double portion. That's a real key, because it shows his standing again in the family, but also in God's process of working with his people, God's purposes for his people, God's saving actions, as theologians say. Joseph was a key to that in many, many ways, which is why he gets the double portion. Even though the Messiah will not arise directly from his line, he has literally delivered Israel in a way that Moses will do generations later. All right. And finally, yes, it ends in a downer in the sense that Jacob has died and Joseph is dying. But both of those deaths have an indicator that they will be returning. There's an indication that as God used Egypt to deliver his people, to save them from starvation and death, that he will use Egypt in a way to deliver his people as well. And that Egypt's benefits from serving God's purposes will be according to their choice. So there it is. There's where the book of Egypt, the book of Genesis ends. It ends of Israel in Egypt with two parts of the promise showing at least the opportunity to be fulfilled. The third one not. But then there's this promise. There is these indicators that God has not given up on them yet. And this is important to understand. It's something that I have a great deal of trouble with. I think a lot of people do, which is you're in the middle of the process, and it doesn't seem like God's on your side sometimes. And to have faith and understanding that we will go through things like, Job, and I certainly don't mean that any of my trials are anything like what Job went through. I'm just saying in the same way that Job went through a process of trials and was eventually rewarded by God. The same thing will happen. We just have to have faith in that middle process. That's the hard part. So I hope that these studies in the book of Genesis have aided you. If you, as I say, if you like it, press like. If you want to be sure I have more of them, why press subscribe. You can reach me at BibleJourneys@yahoo.com. That's my email address. And if you want to get more material like this, in fact, we have the outline of this lesson and some other things available for patrons at patreon.com/BibleJourneys. Well, we begin our study next week on the topic of With Christ in the Crucible. Until then, may God bless you, and let's make an appointment to go on another Bible journey together. Thanks again for spending time with me.